My neighbor insisted I cut down my 100-year-old tree because her kids wanted more sunlight. I refused, and she called the cops on me. I, 37, male, live in a suburban neighborhood in the Midwest, and I've always thought my life here was pretty uneventful. I work as a manager at a local retail store. Not exactly glamorous, but it pays the bills and keeps me engaged with people. My mother and father used to live nearby, but they moved to a warmer state a few years ago. I bought my little house shortly after they left, in part because I wanted to maintain some roots in my hometown. It's a modest place with a large backyard, and the centerpiece of that yard is a towering 100-year-old oak tree. My grandfather planted it when he was a boy, so it's more than just a tree to me. It's a piece of family history, and I consider it practically sacred. The tree's thick branches stretch out far and wide, creating a canopy that shades most of my backyard. Its trunk is massive, so wide that 3 adults would have to link arms to hug it fully. Needless to say, it's a big deal around here, and I've spent countless afternoons under its branches, reading, thinking, or just enjoying the breeze. My father used to tell me stories about how he and his siblings would climb that oak, carve their initials into its bark, and dream big dreams about the future. I've never had the heart to cut a single branch from it unless absolutely necessary. When I first moved in, I was immediately greeted by neighbors who seemed friendly enough. Most smiled, waved, and asked me about my plans for the house. But there was one neighbor who stood out, the woman right next door. She's around my age, maybe a bit younger, and she has 2 kids. At first, she seemed pleasant, introducing herself casually and making small talk. It was nice to feel welcomed. But over time, the interactions with her took on a weird edge. She'd make offhand remarks about my yard, specifically about my old oak. She claimed it dropped too many leaves in the fall and that the pollen in the spring bothered her kids. I shrugged and apologized, but there wasn't much I could do about a natural occurrence. Then, one morning, she cornered me outside while I was watering my lawn and said her kids couldn't get enough sunlight in their backyard because my tree was too large. She wanted me to consider cutting it down so her kids could run around without shadows looming over them. Her request was so startlingly direct, I almost thought she was joking. But she wasn't smiling. In fact, she stared at me with this entitled glint in her eye, as if she expected I'd just whip out a chainsaw and solve her problem. She had that tone of someone who believed the world revolved around her schedule and her wants. I explained to her calmly that the tree had been in my family for generations, and removing it wasn't even remotely on my mind. She scoffed, crossing her arms, and muttered that I was being selfish for prioritizing a tree over children's health. I tried to counter that the tree wasn't hurting anybody, but she refused to listen. Things escalated over the next few weeks. Whenever I came home from work, I'd see her kids in their yard, and she would glare at me over the fence as though I were personally depriving them of happiness. I offered a compromise. I said I'd hire a professional arborist to check if there were any dead branches or if a small trim was needed. At least that might reduce some of the shade. But she wanted the entire thing gone. For her, trimming a few branches wasn't enough. She insisted that her kids deserved the full sunlight experience. I shook my head and repeated my stance: the tree stays. After that, the tension between us became a palpable wave every time we made eye contact. She'd ignore my greetings, hiss under her breath whenever she saw me, and send me passive-aggressive notes left on my front door about how trees attract pests, how they could topple in a storm, or how the roots might damage property lines. She even threatened to bill me for any leaves that blew onto her yard. It was all so absurd. Then came the day the cops showed up at my door. It was a Saturday morning, and I was tidying up the kitchen when I heard the knock. I opened the door to find 2 officers standing there, looking slightly uncomfortable. They said they received a report that I was causing a disturbance with a potentially unsafe tree and that I was refusing to address a major hazard. I think I actually froze for a moment, trying to comprehend the situation. I invited them to step around the side of the house so they could see the tree. The moment they laid eyes on it, one officer seemed visibly perplexed. He asked if there had been any falling branches or immediate threats. I explained that I had the tree inspected recently, and it was perfectly healthy. The other officer asked if I had any documentation from an arborist to confirm. Thankfully, I did. I had a certificate stating the tree was stable. They looked it over, nodded, and said they didn't see any reason to take action against me. They also mentioned that my neighbor had made some vague claims about me creating a community hazard and suggested I was endangering her kids. But once the officers saw the backyard, they seemed unconvinced by her accusations. They apologized for the trouble and left, clearly seeing that the complaint was baseless. I stood there in a flurry of emotions: anger, frustration, relief, and a simmering sense of injustice. I never had the cops called on me before, and for something this trivial and downright ridiculous, it was infuriating. Instead of apologizing for wasting the authorities' time, my neighbor emerged from her house to watch them leave. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, still glaring my way, as if the entire world had betrayed her. It was almost comedic. After the cops pulled out of my driveway, I marched toward the fence line and told her that, if she had a problem, she should come talk to me like an adult and not involve the authorities over nonsense. She huffed, said, "This isn't over," and slammed her door. I went inside, fuming. But little did I know, that was only the beginning of what would become a twisted, escalating battle over my beloved oak tree. In the days following that police visit, I tried to keep a level head. Friends told me to just ignore her. Maybe she'd get bored and move on to a new target. However, my neighbor proved she was anything but the type to let things slide. She seemed to take my refusal to chop down the tree as a personal attack on her authority. It's like she believed she held dominion over the neighborhood, and my noncompliance was some grand act of rebellion. At first, I noticed smaller acts of pettiness: random piles of leaves raked onto my driveway, probably from her yard, trash cans mysteriously knocked over near my mailbox, occasional yelling from her backyard that I couldn't fully make out but seemed directed at me. It was juvenile, but I managed to tune it out, hoping she'd tire herself out. Then one evening, I came home after a long day at work and found a thick envelope stuffed into my mailbox. Inside was a letter from a local attorney's office, claiming that my neighbor was prepared to take legal action if I didn't remove or drastically trim the oak tree to reduce shade encroaching on her property. I was stunned. The letter stated that her children had a right to ample sunlight and that the tree was infringing on the enjoyment of her property. It cited some vague nuisance ordinance I never even heard of. She demanded immediate compliance or threatened to sue for damages. I felt my stomach twist. The thought of going to court over a tree seemed ludicrous, but I also knew lawsuits could become lengthy and expensive, even if they had no real basis. My father had some legal acquaintances, so I gave him a quick call for advice. He reminded me that in most states, a property owner is responsible for the health and safety of their own trees, but as long as the tree isn't causing direct damage or immediate danger to neighbors, there's no law forcing them to remove it. He advised me to gather all the necessary documentation to prove the tree was healthy and posed no threat. That meant contacting the arborist again, collecting all my records, and possibly preparing to stand my ground if she actually filed a lawsuit. I was furious but determined not to let this intimidation tactic scare me into chopping down something so precious to my family. So I contacted another tree specialist for a second opinion, just to cover all bases. That specialist confirmed everything my original arborist had said. The tree was strong, safe, and had zero signs of disease or rot. I spent a few days scanning these documents, labeling pictures, and basically creating a folder of evidence to defend myself. One weekend, in the midst of this tension, I heard a loud commotion outside. I looked out the window and saw a group of workers in hard hats near my fence, accompanied by none other than my neighbor herself. She was pointing at my oak tree, talking to them in hushed but intense tones. Alarmed, I threw on my shoes, ran to the backyard, and demanded to know what was going on. One of the workers, looking uncomfortable, admitted that my neighbor had hired them to evaluate the tree's hazards and see if they could trim it from her side. I told them they were not to touch a single branch of my tree without my explicit permission or a court order. They hesitated, clearly unsure if they were even allowed to do any work. Then my neighbor started screaming that she had every right to trim the branches overhanging her property line. She shouted something about how she would do whatever it took to protect her children. The workers looked at me, looked at her, and then decided they'd rather not get in the middle of a dispute. They packed up their gear and left before things escalated further. It didn't end there. She tried leaving multiple voicemails on my phone, threatening to sue if I didn't allow her team back to properly trim the tree. I ignored most of her calls and simply relayed any new letters to my father's acquaintance, the lawyer. The lawyer assured me that in our state, neighbors can trim overhanging branches up to the property line, but they can't harm the overall health of the tree or threaten its stability. If they do, they could be held liable for damages. The key was that she needed to stay within legal bounds. My neighbor, however, wanted the entire oak gone, which went far beyond any permissible trimming. Tensions were at an all-time high. Every time I glanced out my window, I'd catch her staring right back. Sometimes she'd even stand by the fence with her arms crossed, glaring at my backyard like it was some personal affront to her. It felt surreal. I couldn't believe a 100-year-old tree was creating such chaos. But then again, it wasn't really the tree, was it? It was her sense of entitlement and absolute refusal to accept that her demands might be unreasonable. Then, in a moment that sent me reeling, she started involving her kids in her tirades. One afternoon, I overheard her coaching them to go into the backyard and chant something about "down with the tree." At first, I thought I was hearing things, but then I saw them chanting in unison while she looked on approvingly. It was so bizarre and unsettling. It felt like a show put on just to annoy me, but it also made me worry about how far she was willing to go to manipulate the situation. I knew I couldn't keep living under this constant stress, so I decided it was time to go on the offense. I was done playing nice, done hoping she'd back off on her own. The next step would be to leverage everything I'd learned about property law and nuisance claims, and if necessary, file my own complaint for harassment or file a civil suit seeking an injunction to keep her from threatening my property again. But before I took the big step of legal retaliation, I wanted to see if there was a more direct way to put an end to her nonsense. I wanted a form of justice that would make her realize her intimidation tactics wouldn't work, but also wouldn't risk me looking like the villain. After all, she'd already called the cops once. If she called them again and spun another tale, I wanted to ensure I had a solid record of her behavior. That's when I decided to set up a few security cameras around the perimeter of my yard. 2 were aimed directly at the fence line, so if anyone approached the tree without my permission, I'd have it on tape. I also kept a small dash camera pointed toward my driveway in case she tried anything with my car. It seemed a bit paranoid, but given her antics, I felt justified. Little did I know those cameras would capture more than I'd bargained for and set the stage for a showdown that would rock our quiet street. Several nights later, while I was unwinding in the living room, I heard an odd clanking noise coming from outside. My heart pounded as I peered through the blinds. Sure enough, there was a figure near the fence line, moving suspiciously close to my oak tree. I quickly checked the live feed from the cameras on my phone. The faint glow of a flashlight danced around the base of the tree, illuminating what looked like a small saw or cutting tool in the person's hand. My adrenaline surged. I realized it was my neighbor creeping around my yard in the dark, presumably trying to sabotage my tree. I dialed the non-emergency police line, explaining that someone was trespassing on my property and potentially vandalizing a historic tree. They dispatched officers quickly because trespassing can be serious. While I waited, I stepped out onto my porch, floodlight blazing, and shouted for her to get off my property. She froze like a deer in headlights, then sprinted back into her own yard. By the time the cops arrived, she'd retreated inside her house, lights off, pretending nothing had happened. Luckily, my camera footage told a different story. The officers knocked on her door, but she refused to come out. So they wrote up a report based on my statement and the camera evidence, documenting her attempt to damage private property. I gave them a copy of the video on a flash drive. They advised me to keep the footage safe and to file for a restraining order if she tried this again. I felt a surge of vindication. I wasn't powerless. She had crossed a line, and this time it was all on record. When I woke up the next day, there was no sign of her or her kids. I half expected to see them staging another demonstration in the backyard. Instead, everything was eerily quiet. My lawyer friend suggested we draft a cease and desist letter, detailing her trespassing, harassment, and the attempted vandalism. We included references to local statutes about property damage and trespass laws, ensuring she'd realize we meant business. I sent it via certified mail, so she couldn't deny receiving it. A week went by without any drama. I almost believed she had finally backed off. But the truth was, she was just regrouping, preparing for her next move. One afternoon, I got home from work and found city officials in my yard, accompanied by none other than my neighbor. She wore this smug expression, arms folded, as if she'd just scored a major victory. One official approached me, stating they'd been called to inspect an illegal structure or a hazard on my property, my oak tree. She must have claimed it posed some code violation or was too close to the property line. I shook my head, pulled out the same arborist documents, and explained this was a healthy tree well within my boundary lines and not violating any local regulations. After a thorough inspection, the city officials agreed there was no infraction. If the tree had been rotting or leaning at a dangerous angle, it might have been a different story, but that wasn't the case. I tried not to smirk when I saw her face turn sour as they informed her they had no grounds to force a removal. She threatened to complain to their supervisor, insisting she'd find a loophole. I simply thanked the officials for their time, walked them to the door, and shut it firmly. That day, something inside me snapped. I'd had enough of her harassment, her manipulations, and her weaponizing every authority she could find against me. I decided it was time for real revenge, something lawful but potent. My father had mentioned that in certain circumstances, someone who repeatedly calls authorities or abuses the legal system to harass a neighbor can be reported for malicious prosecution or harassment. I wanted to ensure she felt the consequences of her never-ending campaign to uproot my life. So I contacted my lawyer friend again, and together we assembled a detailed complaint outlining every incident: the false police reports, the attempted trespass with a cutting tool, the repeated calls to city officials, the frivolous attorney letters, everything. We then filed a petition for a restraining order, citing her consistent harassing behavior. According to our state statutes, repeated harassment, baseless claims, and trespass can justify an order that prohibits further contact or intimidation. This wasn't done lightly. It was a serious step, but I was at my wit's end. A court date was set for a few weeks later. I had my camera footage, copies of letters, witness statements from neighbors who'd seen her bizarre behavior, and even audio from one of her phone calls I'd recorded. Meanwhile, she tried to double down on her accusations, claiming I'd endangered her kids. She even attempted to spin a story that I'd threatened her personally, but the lack of evidence in my documented timeline worked in my favor. During the hearing, she seemed unnaturally confident at first, but as my lawyers systematically presented each piece of evidence, her bravado started to crumble. The judge was unimpressed with her hodgepodge of complaints, especially since none of them proved any real harm. My neighbors ran about sunlight rights, and her kids' entitlement to a fully lit backyard fell on deaf ears. The judge even asked her if she had any genuine professional evaluations stating the tree was dangerous, to which she admitted she never had an official inspection. She only had her own assumption that it was a threat. By the end, the judge granted me a restraining order against her, effective immediately. She was instructed to cease any harassment, trespassing, or malicious reporting. If she violated those terms, she could face contempt of court charges or worse. The feeling that washed over me was equal parts relief and triumph. She'd wasted so much of my time and energy, and now there was a binding legal document forcing her to back off. But I wasn't done yet. The restraining order only solved half the problem. I wanted her to understand she couldn't terrorize someone into compliance just because she had kids and wanted extra sunlight. So I decided to level up my revenge in a way that would ensure she felt the sting of her actions financially and socially without breaking any rules. If she couldn't be reasoned with, maybe she'd at least think twice before crossing me again. With the restraining order in place, she was barred from contacting me directly or indirectly, which meant no more surprise visits from random work crews or late-night vandalism attempts. But I knew her sense of entitlement ran deep, so I prepared for the possibility she'd keep trying. Her house was close enough that I'd still see her coming and going, but she wasn't allowed to speak to me, threaten me, or set foot on my property. The first part of my revenge was straightforward. Since she had used an attorney to send me legal threats, I instructed my lawyer friend to draft a bill for all the arborist consultations I'd had to pay for, all the camera equipment I'd installed because of her, and every other expense I'd incurred as a result of her harassment. We included a demand for reimbursement, backed by itemized receipts. Normally, you can't just bill a neighbor for personal decisions, but we framed it under the concept that her malicious conduct had forced me into these expenses. If she refused, we consider small claims court to recoup some of the costs. Did I think I'd get every penny back? Probably not. But the nuisance of having to respond to legal demands in small claims court might teach her a valuable lesson. The second part of my plan was a bit more personal, but still legal. I reached out to local neighborhood watch and community boards, providing them with the video evidence of her trespassing and sabotage attempts. I never publicly named her children or tried to humiliate them. My issue wasn't with them, but with a mother's entitled behavior. However, I made sure the neighborhood was fully aware of the lengths she'd gone to in order to bully me. In many suburban areas, news travels fast, and soon enough, other neighbors began to shun her. People who'd once chatted with her during block parties, or at the local playground started keeping their distance, unwilling to associate with someone who'd stooped so low. The backlash was almost immediate. I heard from one neighbor who told me she'd approached them, trying to rant about my tree, but they'd brushed her off, citing the security footage they saw. She apparently grew furious that her attempts to rally people against me were falling flat. Before long, she was isolated socially, getting cold shoulders at community gatherings. This might not seem like much, but in a tight-knit neighborhood, social alienation can feel like a massive blow. A few weeks passed without incident. My cameras showed no more late-night prowling. I started sleeping more soundly, relieved that the daily anxiety had subsided. Then, one quiet Saturday morning, I noticed a for sale sign planted in her front yard. She was moving out. I admit, I felt a bit of satisfaction. All her efforts to strong-arm me, all her attempts to tear down a piece of my family's history had backfired. If anything, she made her own life miserable to the point of fleeing the neighborhood. The day she and her kids packed up a moving truck, I was trimming some ivy in my front yard. Our eyes met briefly as she loaded boxes. She glared at me, but said nothing, probably for fear of violating the restraining order. I smirked inwardly, thinking about how her entire plot to remove my oak tree had ended with her leaving, while the tree still stood tall and proud. And just like that, she was gone. After she moved, I got a letter from her lawyer, or maybe she'd retain a new one, claiming she would not pay a dime of the itemized costs I'd outlined. My own lawyer told me we could pursue it in small claims if we wanted, and we had a decent chance at getting at least some compensation. So I filed. She tried to ignore the summons, but the court eventually mandated her appearance. With the footage and documentation in hand, the judge ruled that she should reimburse me for a portion of my costs, especially the arborist fees, since they were directly tied to defending against her baseless hazard claims. She didn't take that ruling well, but she had no choice. Eventually, a check arrived for the required amount, albeit later than it was supposed to. The sense of closure was immense. Though the money wasn't life-changing, it was a symbolic victory. It sent a clear message. You can't bully someone, abuse the legal system, and expect no consequences. Reflecting back, the real moral here is that entitlement and arrogance can lead people down a self-destructive path. My neighbor never once considered a genuine compromise. She wanted it all: a yard flooded with sunlight, immediate compliance with her every demand, zero concern for a tree that carried a century of history. And she tried to achieve it through lies, harassment, and intimidation. But the truth has a way of surfacing, and justice, even if slow, can be incredibly satisfying. Now my oak tree stands as majestic as ever, a reminder of my grandfather's legacy and of my own personal stand against bullying. When I see its leaves rustle in the breeze, I feel a sense of pride. This tree has weathered storms, winters, and now a battle with one of the most entitled people I've ever encountered. And each time I walk into my backyard, I'm reminded that sometimes holding your ground, quite literally, can pay off in ways that go far beyond just preserving something old and beautiful. It can reaffirm your dignity, your right to peace, and your resolve that some things are worth fighting for. For anyone reading, I share my story not as a battle cry, but as a cautionary tale. Stand up for what matters, document everything, and don't let the bullies win. You have more power than you realize. My neighbor tried to uproot a part of my heritage, but in the end, she uprooted herself. And my century-old oak tree is still here, providing shade, shelter, and a testament to perseverance.